electoral college requirement of 270 electoral votes, or failing that, a majority of the states in the House of Representatives voting your way, which an independent basically can't. As long as you've got that happening, basically now an independent can't win. They could be a spoiler, but they can't be a winner, because you've got, 5, 6, 8, whatever states that are going to go Democratic no matter what. And the same on the Republican side. So 270 is just not there for an independent. Yeah. And I think now it's kind of settled among a lot of people that, there's really not a big point of it unless you're trying to tip an election one way or the other, or just throw a tantrum.
Yeah. I'm going to thank you. I'm going to open it up. I guess we've opened it up, Raluca, to a wider audience. And so I want to welcome, this is John Florescu. I'm in Romania right now. And I have Charlie Cook, actually in the state of Maine, where he now keeps a residence. And I welcome back a second time, and actually an interesting time, because we had the State of the Union last week, which we discussed briefly now. And also we have the anniversary of the invasion in Ukraine, which of course is of great interest where I am here, where we share a border with Ukraine, where sometimes you even hear jets going by my office here in Bucharest on sort of circling around. I don't know exactly where they're going. Charlie Cook is well known, and he's a political analyst. He's an author. He's a writer, a speaker from Louisiana. And he has been a groundbreaking publisher of the Cook Political Report, now with Amy Walter. And so that is still working at full throttle. Recently, Charlie was a resident scholar at the Institute of Politics at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So thank you again, Charlie, for coming back, and welcome to our circle.
Yeah, John and I have known each other for so long that I can't even remember when we met, but it was 30 odd years ago, wherever it was.
Yeah, somewhere in Washington when I was working for Paul Kirk. Let me open a question, which is, I think, on a lot of Democrats' mind, and certainly most Americans. What do you think the Democrats feel about President Biden making another go for it?
Well, there's a lot of sort of paradoxical feelings. President Biden is very well liked in the party, and he has very, very few enemies. But at the same time, there is a feeling that at 80, having just turned 80 years old in November, he'd be 86 at the end of a second term. That's I think there's a great deal of majority of Americans, a majority of Democrats would rather him not run. But at the same time, they do tend, certainly Democrats tend to like him, and they're not terribly anxious to rely on Vice President Kamala Harris. And while there are a lot of alternatives out there, but a lot of them aren't terribly well known, and all these people are unknown until they get known. So I don't. It certainly looks like the president is going to run again. I don't expect he would have any serious opposition for the nomination, even though there's a great deal of hesitancy about whether he should be doing this, and primarily because of the age issue.
I see. Yeah, that seems to track pretty well with what I picked up. I also feel on the other side, with the Trump side, that Trump sort of lost the plot a little bit. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, when you think back to 4 years ago, a Republican, unless you were in that little slice of never Trumpers, if you had a negative view of President Trump, you kept it to yourself. I mean, that there was no, any opposition was largely kind of muzzled or self-muzzled. But today, where you've got his vice president looks pretty likely to run. His Secretary of State looks pretty likely to run. His UN ambassador, a slew of senators and governors that supported him or that he supported, and the Koch the Koch operation, Club for Growth, all these groups that were clearly behind him, not necessarily enthusiastically, but behind him last time, are not this time. But at the same time, the rules are such that if it was a one-on-one race, like let's just say Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump, I think Trump would lose. But it's not likely to be a one-on-one. It's a one-on-one race, and until it boils down to just one alternative to Trump, given the Republican rules that are sort of winner take all or winner take most in most states, unless the field of alternatives to Trump winnows down very, very quickly, then he's got a big advantage. When all said and done, I don't really think he's going to end up with the nomination, but there's a long way between here and the Republican convention in July of 24.
Well, it seems like just Nikki Haley, I heard, just announced a couple hours
ago. Yeah, she announced
ago
this morning, and you're going to have at least a handful of others in the next month or so, and several of the alternatives, for example, Ron DeSantis, several of these people are sitting governors, and they have some reasons why they can't really jump in right now, or why it would be disadvantageous. And in the case of DeSantis in Florida, Florida actually has a resign to run law, where if he announces his candidacy, he has to resign as governor until the legislature changes the law, which I expect will happen in the next 60 days, but where he can't really jump in right now.
I don't think that's in Massachusetts with Mike Dukakis, was it?
Most states don't have that, but Florida does.
Well, DeSantis seems to be starting out on a good foot. I think I saw that for first try candidates, he's somewhere around 30% or even higher than 30%, which is better than Ted Kennedy and a whole bunch of other Obama and others.
Yeah, it depends on it depends a lot on how it's asked. Again, if it's one-on-one with Trump, he's generally ahead in most of the polling. But when you list 6, 8, 10, 12 options, then that's where Trump's, roughly third of the party that he's got locked up is enough to give him a lead. But, I think that what you can say about DeSantis is that he has very effectively reverse engineered the Trump appeal and sort of replicated Trump without Trump, Trump without the personality, unusual personality characteristics and personal baggage. And it's not to say that nobody else can, but, I think the odds of Republicans nominating an old-fashioned Republican of the, McCain, Romney, George W., H.W., Bush, Ronald Reagan, Bob Dole, there's very, very little chance that Republicans are going to go to a nominee that's from that wing of the party, regardless of what happens to Donald Trump.
I mean, this election turns, if it both goes the way we imagined, it feels a bit like the Soviet Union after, when you had Chernyshov and three other leaders at the same time who died in quick succession. And I think there's a mood somehow that people will say, well, we want to see some young faces very soon. But it's very likely that might not be the scenario at all.
I was listening to a podcast the other day, and James Carville was saying that the U.S. population is now, I think he said it was $330 million, and could we please come up with two candidates that are under 75, and which was an interesting. Because I mean, if we do have a Trump Biden rematch, it would actually be the 7th rematch in U.S. history, but it would also be the first matchup between a septuagenarian and an octogenarian, and it would be certainly a first in that realm.
I know you rely heavily on polling data, but I'm going to ask you a question for the future, at least the immediate future, talking about the hot topics that divide Republicans and Democrats. The culture war obviously seems to be a very big issue, or the emergence of the woke agenda issue. How do you see that coming down in the next election?
Well, I think increasingly, as a lot of the big problems facing our country are not easy to solve, that it's become very easy, very tempting for the parties to go to culture instead. And that and to basically try to create outrage. And you could argue that a lot of our cable television news are sort of outrage machines, that they churn out content, designed to get people all agitated and worked up, either for one side or against the other. And that we now have, there's now a term, negative partisanship, and it's people who, in both sides have some of these people, they hate the other party and the other party's leaders even more than they even like their own party.
Yeah, correct.
And in fact, one of the arguments against Trump winning the Republican nomination is a growing sense among a lot of Republicans that may have voted for him twice and may have agreed with a lot of his policies, but a feeling that he may not be electable. And, God forbid Biden get a second term, or Kamala Harris elected, or Elizabeth Warren, or whoever, that the idea of nominating someone that would not have a good chance of winning is appalling to them. And it actually is kind of a reminder of how Biden won the nomination in 2020. I mean, after coming in fourth place in Iowa and fifth in New Hampshire, it wasn't until a lot of Democrats suddenly realized that there was a real danger of Bernie Sanders winning their nomination. Yeah. And that's when they all pulled behind a guy that, a couple of weeks earlier looked like he was going to be political roadkill.
Yeah. Well, I say, on the question of who else could be there, you're an insider. Who's there sort of waiting at home, trying to figure out whether President Biden is going to run again? Is there anybody you think who are the top three people that may just pop up as Democrats, beginning, let's say, with the governor of California?
Okay, yeah. These lists are so long, I now have them all typed out so I don't forget anybody. Obviously, you've got the vice president checking on the president's health every day. And by the way, this week, later this week, he is going to Walter Reed for his first physical in 15 months. And presumably and hopefully he will get a clean bill of health. But you've got, I call it 6 governors that would be looking at it. For example, J.B. Pritzker from Illinois, Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan, Phil Murphy, New Jersey, Jared Polis, Colorado, Gavin Newsom, Colorado, Roy Cooper, North Carolina. You've got, I think, Elizabeth Warren. Amy Klobuchar would probably run again. Pete Buttigieg, who's now Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Transportation. I think you would have, within a matter of a week or two, if the president were to announce he was not running, I think you'd have almost instantaneously, you'd have a half dozen candidates, because there's not a fear of Harris. Now, it would not be because, she does have a very strong demographic base within the party. Yeah. She wouldn't be easy to beat, but she's not formidable enough to keep other people from running.
Yeah, naturally. Do you think somehow, looking at the State of the Union message, that Biden stole the step out of Trump a little bit, talking about fighting for the little guy with junk fees, such as resort charges, or playing to an America First crowd, or talking about tightening the screws on the southern border? Did you feel like he was borrowing a little bit from what Trump played as his cards?
Well, I think populism is clearly on the rise in the U.S. as it is a lot of places around the world, and fighting for the little guy. There's a certain amount of that. I don't think I would ever expect luggage fees for checking bags on airlines would make it to a State of the Union message, but it strikes me as a little small ball. But clearly, they wanted him to relate to the frustrations that people have in their daily lives, fees on bank accounts and things. And, I tend to prefer focusing on the bigger, broader challenges facing the country. But clearly, the president has a team of smart people around him, and they saw utility in it. And I'm sure they know what they're doing.
Yeah, I will shift out of the United States overseas and right to this neck of the woods, the Ukraine. I think it was the New York Times that said recently that the strategy of Putin is to wait out the West, Is that what, do you share that view? I know this is not a poll, but your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, no, I'm certainly no foreign policy expert, no less than probably anybody on this call, but I think that's probably a fair characterization of Putin's strategy. But I'd say that a strategy of ours is to bleed him and bleed Russia dry, just let them bleed out. That you hate to see the loss of life in Ukraine and the destruction of that country, but to the extent that it's having an enormously debilitative effect on one of our two biggest rivals, there is something to be said for that. They certainly don't seem to be nearly as formidable as most of us thought they were a year and a half ago. But so I think it's a good characterization of how both sides view this.
Yeah.
And the poor people in the short end are the people of Ukraine.
The splits that are occurring in Europe and in the United States to some extent between the two parties, you hear about the Republicans wanting to step back a little bit. You see in Germany, it takes some months to send a tank, trying to have a little bit both ways. How do the figures, the polling numbers show, where do they see those cracks in the support for Biden's policy here?
Well, I think first in the Republican Party, you should probably divide the Republican Party into the old-fashioned traditional legacy Republican Party that had its base in strong anti-communism and the evil empire that President Reagan spoke about. And you'll see the Mitch McConnells are clearly of that school. But then some of the more Trumpian, more isolationist elements, nationalistic, isolationist elements within the Republican Party, they're showing. Well, they reflect what happens after Afghanistan and Iraq, when so much lives, limbs, and treasure were lost by those two. That you see that on the left and the right. I think the American people don't have any idea how much we are spending there. And while I personally am very supportive of the effort, I think it's probably a good thing the American people don't know how much we're spending there, because if they did, they might be taking an even dimmer view of this than they are. But there is a weariness that's setting in, and a realization that, we're spending a lot of money that could be spent here. But on the other hand, if it's bleeding our one of our two big adversaries dry, there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, I certainly saw that. I was in Texas over the holidays down in Houston and Austin, Texas, and I felt that a lot of people felt, well, maybe we ought to be spending a little bit more at home. What happened to all this infrastructure spend? All that money could be going out the door. Is that more an issue for Democrats as well, or is it just Republicans?
I just think it's more, it's not Democrat Republican as much as people who, gosh, we need this money here at home, versus people who are thinking, what's the cost if Russia succeeds and dominates Ukraine? What is the cost of that? and where else is next? And, it's pay me today or pay me later. So it's people that are sort of looking, I think some people that are looking more at the long game realize that as much as we'd rather be spending the money here at home, there is an enormous price if we were to let Ukraine fall and let Russia dominate, and that there would be this would be replicated in other countries in Eastern Europe.
There must be a sense, though, that, Ukraine, most people don't know where Ukraine is or had little idea where it was. And if Ukraine fell, it's sort of like Crimea or the stands, or, they have a very distant idea of this menace, as it were.
Well, it's true that very few Americans could find it on a map. That's absolutely true. But, we left Washington a year and a half ago and moved to a small town in Maine. And this little village of, 4,000 people raised $40,000 last year for at an event for Ukrainian relief. Where there is a sense, it's kind of a David and Goliath, and that you may not be able to find Ukraine on a map, but there's a certain admiration that a lot of people have that wow, these people are showing a lot of courage, and if they're willing to give up what they're giving up, then we ought to back them to the extent we can. But there's it is not uncommon to see people with little Ukrainian flag lapels, and I'll tell you,
in Maine.
Yeah, well, here in Maine, or just sort of political figures, media figures. I mean, I've seen quite a few people doing that, or with the Ukrainian flag out front of their house. And 2 years ago, I couldn't have told you what those three colors, what the two colors represented.
Well, yeah, David and Goliath. I guess there's something, I think, in the American character that nobody likes a bully, and
Yes.
Russia looked like a bully. And that tunes people off. It reminds them of the bully in the playground that's always trying to pick a fight. But when things get a little worse, like a few months ago when the cost of gas was going up and, it's eased off a little bit, that must factor in a bit.
Of course, yes. And I think the 2022 election was there was a lot going on there, a lot of moving parts, but I think one element that was important was the fact that gasoline prices in the United States started dropping, 3 or 4 months before the midterm election. That I think that was one of 4 or 5 factors that helped Democrats survive what otherwise might have been a bloodbath. The
Right.
abortion issue and Supreme Court decision, Republicans nominating some pretty, I like to use the term exotic candidates in some key races, and then just a Trump fatigue and a feeling that discomfort with January 6th or election denying, that had an effect on a slice of independent voters that they may not have been really terribly supportive of Biden or the Democratic agenda, but they were a little bit more worried about Trump and the sort of MAGA agenda.
Right. Now, with everything's moving along so nicely, I don't want to interrupt, but if there are any questions that, Raluca, you are queuing up too much that you want to turn to, or I'm happy to continue as we're going along.
I think Alan has a question.
Alan.
Go ahead, Alan.
I think we don't hear Alan's mic. Alan, your mic?
Turn off.
So you need to unmute.
There you go.
There we go.
My question is, why don't we deal with Putin in a decisive way? Why do we let this continue to drag on? Is it Germany that's the cause, or is it Biden's timidity, or what is the reason behind our delay in dealing with this?
Well, again, let me do the disclaimer that I'm no national security expert, but
Oh, and policy.
I think though we have gone, if someone told you 50 weeks ago that we would be giving the aid that we are giving, I think a lot of us would find it astonishing that we would be worried, my gosh, if we hand over some of our more sophisticated weapons, what would Putin, use nuclear warheads or whatever? So I think there's a sort of how far can we go in this without tipping this over into a place that none of us want to go? And it's not a knowable, there's no bright line, I think, for us to see. So I think we're pushing it, and we're pushing it forward, but nobody wants to start a nuclear war, but you don't know where his line is. And a cornered animal is real dangerous. And to the extent that Putin starts feeling cornered, he may do things that none of us would like to see. So I think there's if there was something we could do that would be decisive, that we knew would not trigger a nuclear, some kind of a nuclear exchange, I think we'd do it in a heartbeat. But
yeah,
who
I think
knows
that's
what that
right.
is?
I think that's right. I saw in the Times of London the other day that a general was arguing that we've called Putin's bluff and he's not going to use nuclear weapons, because if you remember how tiptoey we were at the beginning of this thing, and then now they're talking about outfitting planes. Do you think that's a bit reckless, I guess, huh?
Well, I mean, if I knew where the line was, if we knew where the line was, we could go right up to it. But, how do you know exactly where the line is until you step over it and something god awful happens? And so I don't think we're being timid. It may be, there may be an abundance of caution, but I'm not even sure that that you would say an abundance of caution, with just some caution about not wanting to go too far. But it's just not clear how far we can go without him say, screw it. This is my continued rule here is dependent upon not losing this, and I'll do whatever it takes. So I don't know, but again, I'm just a domestic political person, not a.
Well, you're doing pretty well in foreign affairs here.
We do have another question from Julianne, and this one is domestic. How long do you expect McCarthy to remain Speaker?
Oh, wow. Would I give him a year? Wow, that's a really tough question. I think he has an almost impossible job, particularly given the rules changes that he went along with in order to get the job. That if you can have only one member can call for a vote. I guess maybe it's a little over 50-50 that he survives 1 year, but I wouldn't put a whole lot of money beyond that, because there's some very unusual people in his conference, and some people that some might characterize as borderline crazy. And if your longevity is dependent upon people that are totally unpredictable, and in some cases may not have particularly great judgment, that's. But having being in a position where just one person can call for a new election, man, that's a terrible situation to be in. Oh, hey, Jim.
Charlie, you've been in this business about 40 years, closely associated with the Democratic Party. It must be a lot more difficult in trying to be even-handed in the business of polling, given the complexity of the media environment, the siloing of information. Is it a kind of a complete turnaround or upside down?
I was a pollster once earlier in my life, but now I guess I'm a reformed pollster. But one of the reasons I decided to start a political newsletter in 1984 was that I found myself becoming a swing voter. That I'd grown up in the Democratic Party and found myself voting for Republicans about 40% of the time, which is in kind of poor taste if you're working in the party. So I wanted to do something different. But, you know, in the early years, people on the Republican side were suspect of me, and people on the Democratic side thought I was overcompensating. And God knows I've got some people that were very dear friends that probably aren't talking to me anymore. But, you know, you have a job to do. And mine is just to kind of try to call them as I see them. And I may be, you know, I'm wrong, you know, from time to time, but it's not for a lack of trying to be as fair and even-handed as I can. But, you know, walking a center line, not getting pulled or perceived on either side, it was never easy, but it has never been this hard. Never.
Yeah, imagine. Jim, I see Jim just popped on here. I think he cut short a committee meeting at the legislature. Jim, question from you.
Yeah, I apologize for being late. I would have loved to hear it, but I'm going to go back and watch the tape. So, Charlie, thank you for joining us. I was just going to make a comment to ask you to respond to it. I came in when you were describing the hairbreadth majority that Speaker McCarthy has, and I related it to Romania because he's in a situation more like a coalition government in a place like Romania, where a couple of people can bring down the government at any point. And it seems like we don't have much of that experience in the United States. And it seems like he's learning to what it's like to be in governments like Romania, where they can be brought down by a few people. Just be interested in your reaction to it.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things I talked about earlier was that you know, one of the sources of stability that I think our system had was that we had a two-party system with two ideologically and geographically diverse parties, with plenty of conservatives in the Democratic Party and liberals in the Republican Party and moderates in both. And there was a substantial overlap between the two parties, so that compromise and consensus wasn't hard. But when you saw the ideological sorting that started taking place in the late 80s and in the 90s, where the two parties moved further and further apart, and you know, I think a lot of people would love to see the rise of a third party, but as long as you've got an electoral college requirement or a majority of the state delegations in the House to win the presidency, and the presidency kind of defines our system, we're not going to have an independent president. God knows Mike Bloomberg would prefer to have gone that way than run as a Democrat. And so what was the source of stability in our system is, I think, now a source of enormous volatility. I mean, that, you know, when I go back and we, you know, you and John and I go way back, but, you know, you think of going into 1992 when, you know, Republicans had won the presidency in 4 of the 5 most recent presidential elections, but Democrats had won the House in 20 consecutive elections and 17 out of 20 in the Senate, that there was like voters, you know, the voters came up with a balance of power, and that is, it gave us a stability. But now, with the nature of our parties change, it's now made us incredibly unstable, and a system that you know, my wife calls me a pathological optimist, but there are a lot of days that I get kind of down on where our system is going, and I have to kind of snap out of it, because that's not a nice place to be.
You describe yourself, or seem to describe yourself, as a kind of common sense Democrat. And
No, I've been an independent for.
oh,
I've not been a registered Democrat since the early '80s.
oh, well, then that makes my question even easier. Where do you get your news information from? What do you put on your diet every day of reading?
Well, I do besides putting aside specialized publications, but I do, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. But the other thing I do every night is I watch at least one and often two of the broadcast network news. That is ABC, CBS, and NBC, and not Fox, and not MSNBC, and not CNN, because I want to see what the largest, broadest swath of people are listening, reading, watching, and they're not reading the Washington Post or the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and they're not watching Fox or MSNBC. And, ABC, CBS, NBC, their evening broadcasts, and they don't have nearly the viewership that they used to, but they still have broad enough, and that it's not at least deliberately biased, that I want to see what the average person is seeing. That, if you look at polling data, it's nice to also look at what's the inputs that's going into creating those viewpoints. And so that's kind of how but a lot of specialized publications, just as you and Jim do.
And because the audience is perhaps influenced by sort of selective news sources, do you think the science of polling is becoming more difficult?
Oh, yes. It is, you've got a swath of people that don't trust anyone, anything. And if they don't trust the parties, they don't trust the news media, they don't know who's on the other end of that phone or the other end of that online questionnaire. And I think it's never been more difficult for pollsters to get a representative sample, or to know once they have a sample whether it's going to reflect the realities of the people that are actually going to vote on election day. So it's never been more challenging. Although I will say the polling in the 2022 and 2018 midterm elections was certainly more on than in the last two presidential years. And, we don't know how much of this has to do with the presence of Donald Trump on a ballot. Of course, we don't know whether he will be on the ballot for sure in 2024. So it's definitely very, very challenging for pollsters now, or to have confidence in polling. And I have pollsters that now, they acknowledge that it's never been this hard before.
Yeah, I could imagine. So when you look back, let's say the president's going back to Kennedy's time, can you think of anyone that went a leader, we're talking about leadership, that went against the advice of polls, the overwhelming determination and what's the right thing to do, and came out a complete winner, that threw the polls aside, took a chance, and, seemed like they won on it?
Well, if you hadn't put in the qualification, looked like a winner, I'd say Lyndon Johnson certainly ignored a lot of polls as he was pursuing Vietnam. But
All right. Well, that's
I'd have to think about that. I mean, the thing is, if these folks were prisoners of polls, then Biden would not be looking at running for re-election. And but he is, and has a pretty fair chance of getting reelected, despite the fact that a majority of Americans and plurality of people in his own party don't want to see him run again, or don't want to see him nominated again. But he's obviously, well, I won't say till he announces for sure, but
it seems like it. That's what at least Maureen Dowd seemed to think so this week. Would you say that his handling of the crisis in Ukraine, or I would say his stewardship in dealing with Putin, is something that he'll be able to use effectively, or it's just too hard to say, or too far ahead?
Well, I would say on the one hand, I think it's the thing that he has handled better than anything else. Not perfectly, but better than anything else. But at the same time, I'd say, directly speaking, the war in Ukraine has had no effect on domestic politics whatsoever.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know how long that will remain the case, but it simply hasn't. And for that matter, handling the coronavirus pandemic, it doesn't seem like it was a driving force back in 2020 or since either. So things can be big and important, but not necessarily
Consequential.
politically decisive. And I think whether President Biden wins re-election or loses re-election, I don't think that the war in Ukraine will be a decisive element one way or the other.
I see. We have 2 or 3 minutes left, 4 minutes, I guess. I turn to my colleagues, wherever you are. Any questions? Jim, yours. Okay.
I think Jim's gone.
No, he's still here. He's still here. He probably got distracted. We have about 5 minutes until the top of the hour. So I don't know if anybody wants to say anything in closing.
Well, I would say something. I mean, we don't have to go right to the top of the hour, because I want to just express my thanks to you, Charlie, for always offering us such a tight, well packed together presentation. And I know you do it all the time. I know people are pulling at your sleeve. And I just to say, from our point of view, it's fantastic to have you, to listen to you. And I wish there are many Charlie Cooks coming along right after you as you spend a little more time in Maine or around the country.
Well,
So,
I've enjoyed this thoroughly, and look forward to hopefully seeing your country one day. Thanks a lot.
well, you'll see me. My country is the United States, so I'll look you up when I'm on the East Coast.
Well, yours in the global, broader sense, but anyway, I admire.
Very good catching up, and thanks for all of us.
Take care. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
So long.
Bye.